Rehearse the problem again and see whether some thoughts have occurred to you, and then we'll attack it directly. Free will is a fundamental idea of the Jewish tradition. There's actually a verse that says, choose life, which means that you are able to choose. Otherwise, the verse wouldn't tell you to do that. And the tradition understands that without free will, there would be no responsibility for what you do. Although the connection between free will and responsibility isn't simple and direct, but if you didn't have any free will at all, you wouldn't have any responsibility at all. And when you do use your free will, you're responsible for what you do. You're also responsible for the foreseeable consequences of what you do. And on the surface, there seems to be a problem for free will, a problem coming from something else that the Jewish tradition tells us is true. So it would be an internal problem to the tradition itself, not an attack on the tradition from the outside. And the problem is that God is described as all-knowing, omniscient. So let's imagine that I make a decision today between two alternatives, A and B. The way it feels to me is I could do A and I could do B. They're both in my power. They're both under my control. I choose to do A. That's why A happened. But I could just as well have chosen to do B. And that's why sometimes free will is called free choice, because it seems to imply that there's a choice between alternatives. But now, if we take account of God's omniscience, knowing everything, and ask, yesterday, did God know what I was going to do today? Why not? He knows everything. So even yesterday, God knew that today I was going to choose A. Then the question will be, well, could I really have chosen B? Let's imagine God yesterday knowing I'm going to choose A, and my stubbornly choosing B instead. Wouldn't there be something wrong? How could my action contradict God's knowledge? Isn't God's knowledge perfect, certain, necessary, infallible? Even if I had the mere possibility of doing B, that would mean I have the possibility of making God's knowledge wrong. That just doesn't seem possible. So, if that's the case, I thought I was choosing between A and B. I thought A and B were both under my control. I thought I could do whichever one I want. I thought that the fact that I did A was only because I chose it. And if I had chosen to do B, I could have done B. But really, the critic says, really, you couldn't have done B. So you weren't really choosing between A and B. There wasn't a B for you to choose from. So, if your idea of free will is to choose between two alternatives that are really open to you, that's not what's happening. It's not what's happening. I gave a rough example yesterday of a person put in a room, and he sees in front of him two doors, and he's told only one of them is a door that you can open. Only one of them is an open door. And you only get one choice. He looks at the two of them, and they look identical, so he doesn't know what to do. He chooses one, and he pushes the lever, and it opens. And then he's told, good thing you chose that one, because the other one is just painted on the wall. There's no door there at all. You really didn't have a choice between two doors, picking one, because there weren't two doors in the first place. So the idea is that, given God's knowledge yesterday of what I'm going to do today, my picture of what's going on today is a wrong picture. It's not really choosing between two alternatives. That's the problem of foreknowledge, God's knowing beforehand what's going to happen, and free will, by making choices. Notice where the problem hits. I chose A. I didn't choose B. Foreknowledge doesn't hit A. It doesn't say you weren't really free, you were manipulated, you were pushed, you were caused, you were forced to pick A. That's not what it says. What it says is B wasn't open. It's only attacking the one I didn't choose. Okay, so there are two approaches to this problem. One is a real solution that some people would accept, as we'll see. And that is to point out that when you put the problem, you're leaving something out. You're not really giving a full description of everything that goes into the problem. When you fill in the description carefully and put in all the details that you need to, you see that some of the things you put in, you don't have to put in. You could do it differently. I'll try to do this twice, once in a very intuitive way, and then once perhaps in a more structured way. One thing we didn't put into the description was, how does God know yesterday? How does he know what I do today? How does he get that knowledge? It's pretty natural and intuitive not to ask the question. God is perfect, has no limitations on his power, so, you can just take it for granted. But let's push it. How does he know yesterday what I'm going to do today? Now, here's a suggestion. Yesterday, God takes a peek at the future today and watches me and sees what I do. He sees it before it happens. Now, that would be hard for you and me because we're just people. We're talking about God. For God, time is no barrier. Yesterday, he can look into the future and see what I do today. He watches me choose A. He watches me. That's how he knows yesterday that I'm going to choose A. Well, if that's how he knows, watch how the problem that the critic put falls apart. So in the real world, I choose A. God watching me yesterday sees me choose A, and he knows that I'm going to choose A. Now we're asking about a hypothetical world. What would happen if I decided to choose B? Well, if I decided to choose B, then God, looking from yesterday at today, would see that I choose B, wouldn't he? That's what he would see. So if I choose to do B, then he'll see that I choose B, and then yesterday he'll know that I'm going to do B, and there's no contradiction at all. The real world is perfectly okay, and the hypothetical scenario that I do B is also perfectly okay. There's no contradiction. How do we manufacture the problem? We manufacture the problem by, without reason, we took God's knowledge yesterday in the real world, and we transferred that over to the hypothetical where I do B. We kept God's knowledge constant. Well, who says you can do that? Who says you have to do that? The alternative is to say, in the real world, I choose A, and yesterday he knows I'm going to choose A. That's perfectly consistent. And in the hypothetical, imagining that I choose B, in that world, he knows that I'm going to choose B. And that's also perfectly consistent. Everything's up to my choice. My choice causes the outcome. It's my choice that causes God's knowledge. He's watching me. I choose A, he sees me do that. I choose B, he sees me do that. There's no contradiction at all. So it comes out that even though in the real world where I do A, God knew yesterday I'm going to do A, when we imagine, could I have done B, we have to imagine, could I have done B, and then God in that world watching me will know also that I'm doing B, and then of course I can. It's just as consistent as this world is. So the critic has not succeeded in showing that there's a mistake in the way we understand free will. Is this description clear? Maybe I don't have to go any further than this. The person who said this first, that I know of, was Bertrand Russell, although our sources say something equivalent, but he said it in these terms. Bertrand Russell, who was a famous atheist, said, don't try to beat up the believer with this problem, because this problem has a very simple solution. If God gets his knowledge. Now, it's very interesting to me that the phraseology that's used in our classical sources says exactly that. Tzofa Rosh Tzaddik, Kodesh Baruch Hu observes the wicked and the righteous. That's observing, that's seeing it happen. And it says, and then he draws his conclusions about the Rosh Hashanah, and it says that about the future also. It says, Hakol Tzafui v'Rashus Nesuna, it says in the Mishnah. Tzafui means observed. It's all observed and therefore known, and yet free will is granted. That's what it says in the Mishnah. Tzafui is the same word. So our source, and by the way, the Maharal says this word for word. A few months ago, I happened to see him, and I was very happy to see it. He says it word for word, that God's knowledge comes from observing, and therefore there will be no problem about foreknowledge of free will, says the Derech Chaim. So this is one way out. Now, the Rambam, the great Maimonides, does not use this way out. In fact, in the Guide of the Perplexed, Part 3, Chapter 17, he has a review of schools of Arabic philosophy, and he points out how they differ from the truth, which is the Torah, and how they differ from each other, and what their strengths and weaknesses are. And with one school of philosophy, of Arabic philosophy, he says, they believe that God knows everything, including the future, and they believe in free will, and right away you could see that that's a contradiction. Out, that's out. I'm not having that. And he has a different way of approaching the problem altogether. The question is, why, since what I told you comes from a Saadia Gaon who precedes Maimonides, and from the Rivash, who's later, and from the Akedas Yitzchak and various sources, which do credit this solution, what does Maimonides have against this solution? He doesn't say word for word, but I believe the right answer is this. In the guide, in the first part, he says 6 times, God is not affected. Ein hispa'alus. Nothing has an effect on him. Nothing causes in God anything. He's immune to effect from the outside. Sometimes he says, because if something affected something in God, there would be a change. Before the cause acted, it wasn't there. And then when the cause acted, it is there. So there'll be a change in God. We're not going to tolerate changes in God. But other times, he needs to change out. Just the very idea that something should have the power to cause an effect in God is something that he rejects with both hands. Well, let's see. What have we been saying? That it's my action that causes God's knowledge. He's watching me, and he picks up his knowledge of what I do by watching what I do. I don't think the Maimonides can accept that. Doesn't fit with his concept of what the Creator is. So he has to have a different way of handling it. This in Hilchos Tshuva, in the Mishnah Torah, he talks about it. That he talks about it indirectly in the guide. There's a lot of textual analysis that I'll spare you, but here's the bottom line. We really can't talk about God, the Creator, at all. We can't talk about what he is. We can talk about what he does, but we can't talk about what he is. This is part 1, chapter 54, at great length, repetition. So if I call him Creator, that's not a problem, because the word Creator refers to what he did. He created the universe. But it doesn't refer to what he is. That's beyond our ability to describe altogether. And that being the case, we're not going to talk about God's knowledge. He says, just as we are incapable of understanding God's nature and God's essence, we're also incapable of understanding his knowledge. So if the problem we're facing is a contradiction between God's knowledge and free will, we're just taking God's knowledge off the table. Because speaking of God's knowledge, we'd be speaking about what he is, not just what he does. And we're not supposed to do that. So here, this isn't what I would call a solution to the problem. This is a way of avoiding the problem. You can't raise the problem. And by the way, what Maimonides says, the Kabbalists say also, and Ramchal for one says it word for word, as if he's taking it straight out of the guide. And the Gottleib Rishonim, he says using the same vocabulary. So you say, well, wait a minute, you can't describe God. I mean, aren't there hundreds of descriptions of God? The Hebrew Bible is 1,000 pages long. There are lots and lots, and the Midrash and the Talmud and the prayer book. Telling me we can't describe God, we do it all the time. So Maimonides makes it clear that what's going on is this. Yes, the vocabulary is God is Q. But what it means is God does the things that he would do if he had the quality Q, but he really doesn't. So let's take God as just. Justice is a quality for human beings. It's a quality in the soul. It's a quality in a person's character. That quality of the person's character leads him to act in particular ways. So I would put this in 3 steps. First of all, take the idea that God is just literally for a moment, and then ask, well, because he's just, what would he do? Well, he would make sure that when people act, they act well, the consequences will be reward. They act ill, the consequences will be punishment, and they'll be fitting for the actions that are performed. People will be treated fairly. This is what he would do if he were just. Okay, now just subtract being just and sit with what he would do. And then say, that's what I really meant. I really meant these are the things that will happen because God's running the world. People who do mitzvahs will get rewarded, and people who do transgressions will be punished, and the rewards and punishment will be fitting for the actions that they performed. That's all it's meant by saying that God is just, nothing more than that. In particular, he stresses that in this respect, God and man are not alike. A human being has morality. We've said this in a number of ways in the past few weeks. Human being has morality in 2 dimensions of his life. There are his actions. His actions can be good or bad, just or unjust. And in his character, good or bad moral characteristics, character traits, values, motivations. Human being has morality in 2 different ways. But the Creator doesn't have character. The Creator doesn't have a soul, like we have a soul. The Creator doesn't have character traits. So all that we know about is the actions that are performed. So when we talk about God being just, it's a kind of hypothetical. Is God just? Well, sort of. That is to say, he does the kind of things that justice would require. He does the kind of things that someone with justice would do. But he doesn't have justice the way we have it. He's not human. So let's go to knowledge now. So with justice, it's not hard to explain what are the actions that a just being would do. Let's say mercy. Mercy means that you care for people, you give them things even that they don't deserve, you protect them from the very strict application of justice. That's what mercy requires, and that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does. But so mercy and justice and kindness, those are qualities where it's very easy to say what are the things that are being done when you have those qualities. But knowledge isn't so easy to explain. And by the way, Ramchal in Gottleib Rishonim when he makes this point, and he talks about the various traits that we ascribe to God, and he says over and over they are just meant to indicate actions, he mentions knowledge twice. He explicitly puts knowledge in the same category as justice and mercy and kindness, as some kind of quality of action. Now, I think the right answer here is this. Take the same scheme that I said before. First, pretend for a moment that God really has knowledge, and then ask, since he has knowledge, how would that express itself in action? What is the quality of action of an agent that has knowledge? Well, when something happens, it's appropriately related to everything else. When something happens, it fits into the past and other parts of the present and into the future in an appropriate way. That's what an agent would do with knowledge. He would check to make sure that everything's going to fit. So what we say is that when God manages the world, everything fits in the appropriate way, even though he doesn't have knowledge. So that shows, straight off the bat, that you can't raise the problem. Let's push this a little bit. If his actions fit everything perfectly, well, how does it happen? So you tell me it's not knowledge. Then what is it? And what we have to say is, we don't know. We don't know how it happens. We just know that it happens. When Maimonides describes this in the Laws of Repentance, my oldest son made a very important observation. What he means to say is that when we say he doesn't have knowledge, it doesn't mean he's weak. He's missing something. He's less capable than those who have knowledge. No, he has all the powers of knowledge. He just doesn't have them in the same way. So I'll give you two examples of how to think about this. One, it comes from Maimonides in another context in the guide. Let's suppose you're touring a laboratory, and there's some gadget over there that's 2 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet deep, and it's got all sorts of buttons and lights on it and dials and knobs and things, and you say, oh, what is that? What does that do? And nobody's there to help you, but you've been given permission to do what you like in the laboratory, so you push the buttons and you turn the wheels and you watch the gauges go back and forth, and you think, I push this button, that gauge goes up. When I push this button, the gauge goes down. So it must be that these two buttons control some kind of input which vary from one another and have opposite effects. Maybe it's electricity, or maybe something else. And you play with it and make a record of what you see, and you may begin to get a feeling for, after 6 o'clock, the buttons reverse. Maybe there's a day shift and a night shift. And the night shift people are left-handed. That's why the buttons reverse. You think maybe this is how it works. And over a period of time, by playing with it, you can come to know pretty well what it does. That's one way. Says Maimonides, contrast that with the guy who designed it. He designed the machine. He gave the instructions how to build it. He knows what it's going to do before it even gets built. He doesn't know if watching what it does and figuring it out. He built it to do the things that he wanted it to do. He knows from the inside what it's going to do, because he knows what it is and what it's for. Whereas if I'm in the laboratory, I don't know that. All I know is when I push the buttons, this is what happens. So in the end, both of us know what it will do, but we know it in entirely different ways. That's one example. Maybe I'll give you 3 examples. And then, in quantum mechanics, this is famous, we know what things will do. We do them in the laboratory. They always come out the same way all over the world for decades of constant experimentation. It's just that when you ask, how does that happen? And why does it happen? There's no explanation. There's no explanation. Some physicists have said, if you think you can explain it, you don't understand it. If you understood it, you realize you can't explain it. You have a situation where you have something that produces, let's say, light, and you have a barrier, and the barrier has two slits in it, which let light through. Behind it, you have a photographic plate that catches the light, and you try like this. First of all, you close one slit, turn on the light producer, and the light goes only through the other slit, and of course, it's caught on the photographic plate behind that slit. Close this one and open this one, same thing behind this one. That's what happens when you do one at a time. Now, if you open both of them and turn on the light, well then the light's going through both slits at the same time. I mean, it's a lot of light. And then you get a weird situation on the photographic plate. Instead of getting a splotch here and a splotch here, opposite the slits, you get bands of light and dark. Bands of light and dark. You even get light in places where, when one and the other two slits were open one at a time, no light got to. Now when you open both slits, some light gets to places where were completely dark before. And some places that were light before are dark now. How does that happen? So there's an answer. They compared this with waves at the seashore. If you built a barrier against the waves and then put openings in the barrier, what would happen is this: behind the barrier, the water is calm. Right? Now, if you open one of these holes in the barrier, when the wave hits, it's going to disturb the water and send out ripples. So if one is open, it'll send out ripples. The other one is open alone, send out ripples. If they're both open, you're going to get ripples coming from both openings. Well, what's going to happen when the ripples interact? Oh, well, you see, what's a ripple? Ripple's just water going up and down, right? So let's say the two of them come through, and when they meet, they're both going up. So when they go up, they're going to go up higher because they reinforce one another. And if they meet, they go going down. When they meet, then they'll go down further. They're going to reinforce one another. And what would happen if, when they're coming through, one's going up and the other one's going down? Then they cancel out and you get flat. That's the dark places. So some places will be high, some low, and some will be flat. So it's a wave. So there's no puzzle here. You have to understand that light behaves like a wave, at least sometimes. And when you open both slits and the light goes through, when it comes out the other two slits, it interferes with one another like waves do, and you get light and dark places. That's why you have the stripes. That's fine, except for the next step. The next step is, instead of just turning the light on and letting a mass of light go against the barrier and through the slits all at one time, why don't you just shoot one particle of light at a time? One particle of light at a time. Photon. One at a time. Single particle. Well, the single particle can't go through both slits. It's just one particle. It's got to go through one slit or the other slit. And then there's nothing to interfere. There's nothing there to interfere with anything else or to interfere with itself. It's just one little dot going through. And as Tim Maudlin pointed out, even Richard Feynman got this wrong, the real puzzle is this. Imagine the photon going through the right-hand slit. Okay, it goes to the right-hand slit and then gets over to the place behind the right-hand slit. And same with the left-hand slit. But when you open both slits, you get the bands, light and dark bands. How do you get that? What you're really saying is, when I shoot this single photon, it goes through one slit, but where it goes depends upon the other slit being open, the one it doesn't go through. That's very strange. Why should the one that doesn't go through affect where it goes? Well, there are people like the Copenhagen people who say, shut up and calculate. We know what happens from experiment and just calculate. Others will tell you, when you're not looking, that little photon isn't in any particular place. It doesn't have a position, not anywhere in particular. But it could be in a lot of different places. And there's a certain, more likely to be close by, less likely to be further away, and angles and so forth and so on. And wherever you look, there's some likelihood, big or small, that it would be there. Now just imagine a map of how likely it is to be anywhere in the environment. And imagine that map going through the two slits. That map is big. That map covers the whole area. And now it goes through the two slits, and then it can have waves. I can interfere with one another, and you can get bands. The only trouble is, no map is going through the slits. The map is a mathematical abstraction. There's no physical thing going through the slits. So the situation you're up to is called the measurement problem, and even Maudlin says that's not the right definition for the measurement problem. Okay, Maudlin's a very good philosopher. So what's the attitude? The attitude is, well, we know what it does, but we can't explain how it could possibly do that. With no explanation for that. So it is possible to be in that situation where you know from experience that this is what something does, and to be just without any way to explain it. Will there be a way to explain it in the future? Who knows? If David Bohm's theory worked, maybe it would work to do that. At any rate, when we say that we know what God does, we don't know how he does it because we don't know what he is, that's not somehow a suspicious position to be in. You must be hiding something, Rabbi. What do you mean you don't know? If you don't know, then maybe it's not real, and maybe you can't trust it, and so forth and so on. No, not actually. The world doesn't have to obey my desire for an explanation. The world doesn't owe me anything that I should be able to understand it. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. I have to be relaxed about it and just observe and try and see what happens. So here we're being told this is what God does, and we don't have any no way to explain how it happens that way. We just know that that's what happens. So that being the case, that's the second way to handle the problem of foreknowledge and free will, to understand that you can't describe what God is, and used in that way, the problem doesn't arise. Okay, so this is a problem for which we have two approaches in the classical sources, and each of the approaches is, to my mind anyway, perfectly adequate, and that being the case, we're not overwhelmed with this problem. Are we together? Okay. Now, suppose somebody says, another problem for free will. Listen, Rabbi, you know very well that how we develop, what we do, what we think, what we care about, the decisions we make, is affected by our DNA, first of all, which creates certain basic characteristics of our lives, and also the training that we get, and the education that we get, the interactions with the environment. And when a person makes a decision, he's facing a situation which needs a response. That's why he's making a decision. Isn't it obvious that all of that just programs the decision? Given the DNA and given all of his experience, which molds his character, that's what's responsible for the choice that he makes. And you told us 2 days ago, Rabbi, that if the cause of what he does comes from outside of him, then it's not free will, he's not responsible. Isn't it obvious that free will has to be an illusion? Because everything about what you do is programmed from outside of you. Now, this is a very popular idea, and a lot of people who are trained in science have the idea, and I will now speak fully from my prejudice as a philosopher. Don't trust people when they speak outside their expertise. The fact that a person is a scientist, doesn't give him license to speak about philosophy. Just like when I taught at Johns Hopkins, in those days, discovering new particles was all the rage, and one of the people in the physics department discovered a new particle, so the student newspaper interviewed him for his views on religion. Because he's super smart, isn't he? He's made a real big contribution to atomic science. Surely what he thinks about religion should be very, very important, right? Well, it was, about worthy of a 9-year-old. It was really very naive and poor, so much so that they cut out his article and they put it up in the philosophy department with a title. See what you can find wrong with this. They were, what? Would you interview him for macrobiotic cooking? Because he discovered a particle in physics? Would you interview him about skiing in the Alps? Why do you think you should interview him about religion? It's just nuts. Same thing's true with science and philosophy of science. I'll give you another analogy. Not every great athlete makes a great athletic coach, does he? Because there's a big difference between doing the athletics, on the one hand, and teaching other people how to do the athletics. Those are two different abilities. Although one person could have both, it's certainly not guaranteed that he'll have both. So why should a person who's great in physics be credited with having real understanding in the philosophy of physics? It just doesn't have to happen. It could happen, but it doesn't have to happen. Not everybody who offers an opinion from that quarter is someone who you have to take seriously. He's speaking outside of his expertise. So let's ask here whether the evidence that we have leads to the conclusion that your DNA and your external influences totally program you. Not just influence you, but totally program you. So that there's really no choice that you have. Nothing you can do other than what you do, because it's just forced on you by those outside influences. So I would ask this person, and this is something you should have in your pocket always when someone tells you something science says, you should ask them, what's the evidence for that? That's always a fair question. If the person's portraying what science says, then he ought to be able to show you what the evidence is. What's the evidence that your DNA and environment totally program everything you are and everything you do? Well, one type of evidence is statistics. We know that people from different backgrounds statistically come out different in terms of their abilities. Let's take literacy. So, when I was teaching at Johns Hopkins, in the 11th grade of the public schools, there was a course called Functional Literacy, where they taught you how to read a telephone book and how to fill out an application for a driver's license. About 50% of the students were functionally illiterate. But if you move to Beverly Hills or to Westchester, New York, the literacy rate is 95% instead of 50%. Isn't it clear that the environment and the elements of the environment make the difference? Isn't it obvious that the environment is programming the difference between the two groups? After all, the difference between them is the environment. Well, that's right. But I was asking for evidence of total programming, not influence. I agree that the environment influences the outcome. I was talking about total programming. And you gave me 50% versus 95%. You didn't give me 100%. Now, they have an answer to this, but it's very important, I think, to see why the answer is a mistake. The answer is, yeah, it's true. Our figure for literacy in Beverly Hills is only 95%. But if you look at the people, the 5% who can't read, there's always a reason. There's always a reason. There's some kind of genetic defect, or there was a divorce in the family, or there was drugs in the family. There's always a reason that explains why he's different from the other 19 out of 20. The right response to that is, are you guessing, or have you actually seen the reasons? Have you calculated them? Do you have a census of the population where either the person is part of the 95% or is part of the 5%, and you know the reason of the 5%? Have you done that work or not? And the answer is always no. So why do you say that there's other environmental things that account for the 5%? And the answer will be, well, how else would you account for it? Something's got to be responsible for it. And what you got is DNA and environment. That's all there is. Meaning, I believe what I believe. I believe it before the evidence. I believe it independently of the evidence. I'm committed to it without the evidence. And then when the evidence isn't there, I just say the evidence will be there, if you look. That's not science. Science is supposed to give you the evidence, not just wave a flag and say, I believe the evidence is there. And if you can't do that, then you have no right to the conclusion. Now, there could be very extreme cases which do work. Imagine a gang captures a kid who's 7 years old and injects him with crack. He becomes a crack addict. I think you could predict with 100% certainty that he will steal. Because if you're addicted to crack, you have to have it. If you have to have it, you'll do anything to get it. So there could be cases where the environment does overwhelm the person and produce an absolute outcome. There could be cases like that. But the vast, vast majority of us haven't undergone anything like that. So to say that it works for the crack addict and therefore it works for everybody else is also totally irresponsible. Why should it work for everybody else? There is no good reason to think that everything we do is completely programmed. The best reason that you could have would be to predict beforehand what's going to happen. But as you know very well, no one can do that. No one can predict what people will do. 99.99% of the time, you can't predict what people will do. So, that being the case, you know that you don't have the proof that they are, in fact, totally programmed by what they do. So, that being the case, we don't have to worry about that. We don't have to worry about that conclusion. So, what's the picture now? The picture now is this. How does the influence work? Well, because of the experiences that you've had, you develop certain desires, you develop certain goals, you develop certain sensitivities, and these are lodged in your character, and they all come into play when you have to make a decision. I know I said I would pay back on Tuesday, but I really need the money until Wednesday. What shall I do? Well, there's what I want to do with the money, and there's the fact that I promised, and I try to keep my promises, and I think it's important. And there's the question of my reputation. Could I make up an excuse? I could probably make up an excuse. I won't suffer from it too much. Yeah, but I'll suffer from it somewhat. And there are all these things that the person cares about. And when he makes up his mind what to do, he thinks about them all and takes them into account. But when he makes the decision, it isn't that the decision is just, okay, I got 2 points in favor from here, and 3 points in favor from here, and 6 points in favor from there. That's 9. That's 11. And over here I got 4 points against and 3 points against. 7. No. 11 is bigger than 7, and he makes the choice. No. Even after he calculates the way in which the different outcomes affect what he wants, what he cares about, there's still another factor, the factor of making the decision. And that factor isn't determined by his calculation of what will be good and what will be bad for him in the way that he does it. And I'll give you an example of this. The example is due to John Searle, one of the very good contemporary philosophers. And this will have effects on our continuing discussion. He says, imagine two guys that go to college, and they're friends. And they hang around together, and they share experiences with one another. After they leave college, they say, look, let's keep in touch. And if either one of us needs something, the other one will help him. And they agree, and they do that, and they remain friends. 30 years later, let's call them A and B. 30 years later, A is running for president of the United States. President of the United States. He's the candidate of one of the big Republicans and Democrats. And B's thinking, wow, it's A. A's the one who's the candidate. let me just take a look at his policies. So, B takes a look at A's policies, and he takes a look at the other candidate's policies, and he says, A's policies are good. They are good. B's policies are a little bit better. They're a little bit better. And if I were just voting for president on the basis of the two candidates, I would vote for B. But A's my friend. And I owe him something. We promised to help one another. So, the difference between the policies of A and the competitor are, let's say, 10 points. And my commitment to help my friend is 35 points. So, therefore, I should vote for my friend instead of voting for the other competitor. Now, suppose he has the following thought. Yeah, but this is President of the United States. Should my friendship really affect how I vote for President of the United States? I don't think so. I don't think that's right. So I'll ignore the friendship. And I'll vote only on the basis of the policies. And I'll vote for the other guy. But what happened to the commitment? The commitment to his friend is still there. He just doesn't vote on it. It isn't as if he doesn't care about his friend. He's forgotten about him. It isn't as if he's never going to think about him again. No, he cares about him. He's not letting the caring determine his decision. This, says Searle, is an example of what it means to have free will. You have the free will to ignore some of your motivation in favor of other parts of your motivation. Without that ability to ignore part of the motivation, you wouldn't really have free will. So it isn't just, well, it gets 2 pleasure points and 4 value points, and it has 3 minus fear points and 4 minus irritation points, and add them up and get the outcome. No, we're not just adding up the different motivations that we have. In addition to looking at the motivations, we're deciding what to do. That's the picture that we have. And nothing in what the scientific world can tell you is going to take that away. Of course, this is a subject of great interest, and a lot of people think about it, a lot of people try to find evidence one way or another. There was a fellow named Benjamin Libet, Libet, who did some experiments, people who are making decisions. Now, these experiments are trivial and they're in laboratories and nothing matters. Whether that applies to a person who's deciding who to marry is not obvious at all. It's one of the weaknesses of all these experimental setups. But okay. And he found that when a person makes a decision, right before he makes the decision, there's a certain trigger in his brain that goes off. So, having discovered that and published it, people said, aha, so the person's not really making the decision. That little thing in his brain, since it's there, must be the thing that's pushing him to decide. And he's not really making the decision. But that's not a correct answer. Even Libet, who did the experiments, didn't say that. What he said was, you have this spark that ignites in the brain, and then the person has the power to say no. All he saw was, when you do make the decision, there's a spark. He didn't check whether the spark was there when you don't make the decision. I don't know, maybe it's been too hard in the brain imaging to do it. So he said the free will of the person is the ability to say no to the spark. So I'm mentioning this because things that sound initially convincing, they sound so scientific. It was done in a laboratory, right? It's got to be right, no? No, it doesn't have to be right. The issues are subtle and complicated, and they are open to possible misunderstanding, misinterpretations. If you come across something which claims to be an attack on free will, that's something which you should be very cautious about. Don't be overwhelmed and don't draw any conclusions, but be cautious about it. Especially since, as we said yesterday, you give your whole life positive that you have free will. And not only are you positive, but everybody else is positive. Even the guy who tells you that he doesn't believe in free will, believes in free will. That is to say, he acts as if he had it. He can't help but experience himself making decisions. He can't help experience other people making decisions. He just got in his head a theory which says, wow, this is all an illusion. It's really all an illusion. None of it's really true. But that doesn't mean he doesn't experience it. He experiences it and he just tries to discount it. He experiences it just like everybody else. It's an inescapable experience. So when we think about the idea of free will as the basis for Judaism, up to here anyway, I don't see any contradictions or difficulties that we have to feel that we're at risk or that we're in danger of losing the issue. No, we're not at risk. We're not in danger of losing the issue. It's a controversial issue. It's a very difficult issue, as I said, even in secular philosophy as well. And it's an open issue. I just finished by mentioning, I think that contemporary philosophy, if you're interested in contemporary philosophy, there's a wonderful site called the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, run by the Stanford Philosophy Department, and the authors are authorities in each field. The articles run something like this. This field is about the following types of problems. Here are the 3 or 4 or 5 most important theories in the field. Here are the problems with those theories, and here's what we're looking forward to in further research. There's next to nothing in philosophy about which the contemporary world has decided this is it. So if you're going to go to philosophy to find out what's right, you'll be almost always disappointed. All you'll find out is what people are discussing and debating. But one thing you can do, if the Torah takes a certain position and one out of the 3 theories that the philosophers are working on is a theory that describes what the Torah says, then you know that contemporary philosophy can't rule it out because it's one of the going theories. And that's something which I think is important to know. Even if contemporary philosophy would rule it out, that would just mean that philosophy is wrong, but you'd have to work hard to show that or explain why you didn't take philosophy seriously. And I can say that because I was a philosopher, professor of philosopher, but other people might not find that convincing. But in the case of the vast majority of issues, there's always some strand of philosophy that agrees with us, and then there's dispute and disagreement, because that's the way it is in philosophy. Everything's under dispute and disagreement. So I think that philosophy is a weak participant in the discussion of these matters. Okay, so far? Okay, so tomorrow, Mitzvah Hashem, we'll pick up with some more applications, more practical applications.